It all started so quietly, with a subtle shift in the air that I couldn't quite place. Things between Mason and I had always felt so solid. Our relationship was built on trust, laughter, and the kind of love that makes you believe it can weather anything. But recently it seemed like something was shifting beneath the surface. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Mason had always been the type to come home from work late, especially when he was dealing with big projects, so I didn't think too much of it when he started staying out later and later. But it wasn't just that. It was how he came home. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore, like something was on his mind that he didn't want to share with me. The way his scent, the cologne he'd always worn, started to change, more subtle, almost as if he was masking something. I didn't want to overanalyze. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the stress of work was getting to him, and maybe he needed some space. But as the days went by, I couldn't ignore how he'd become more distant. He'd spend hours on the phone, talking in hushed tones, and when I'd ask about his day, his answers were shorter, more detached. I'd always prided myself on being intuitive, and for some reason this feeling of unease had settled deep in my gut, gnawing at me every time I saw him. I began to wonder if I was imagining things, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was definitely wrong. One evening, I decided to do something I rarely ever did: go through his jacket pockets while he was in the shower. It wasn't because I didn't trust him. It was more out of a strange, overwhelming need to understand why I felt so off. I found it by accident, buried deep in the inside pocket of his coat. At first, I thought it was just a random collection of receipts from things like coffee shops or grocery runs. But as I unfolded them, I realized they were for something far more specific. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, a few names of restaurants I'd never even heard of. There were so many receipts, all from dates when he told me he'd be working late, when he said he was out of town for business. My heart began to race in my chest, and for the first time in years I felt the cold grip of fear settle in my stomach. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at the receipts in my hands, unable to believe what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Mason had always been so careful, so protective of our relationship. I couldn't fathom that he would betray me like this. But there they were, the evidence, right in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run to him and demand answers, but at the same time, I didn't want to confront him. What if I was wrong? What if there was an explanation for all of this? What if I was just reading too much into it? But the more I looked at those receipts, the more my heart pounded in my chest. The dates lined up too perfectly, the dinners too intimate, the hotel rooms too expensive. It felt like a cruel joke, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I could almost picture him there, at those fancy restaurants, laughing, sharing a meal with someone else. I didn't even want to imagine it, but the thought gnawed at me, tearing apart everything I had believed about us. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just being dramatic, that I had misinterpreted the whole thing. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't even look at Mason the same way after that. I spent the rest of the night pretending like nothing had happened, like I didn't have these receipts in my hands, like I wasn't falling apart inside. I had no idea what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't live with the uncertainty. The doubt in my mind was suffocating me. I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. And as I lay there next to him that night, pretending to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. I didn't know it yet, but that moment was the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my marriage to Mason. The receipts were my first clue, my first glimpse into the betrayal that was already happening behind my back. I didn't know where it would lead or what I would discover next, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had already been lost. The more I stared at those receipts, the more the weight of what they implied sank in. At first, I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking it, that there must be some logical explanation. Maybe it was a business trip he hadn't mentioned, or a work dinner that slipped his mind. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the pieces didn't fit. These weren't the kind of places I'd expect him to go for business. These were romantic dinners, hotel stays at high-end resorts, things I'd only dreamed of experiencing with him. And all of them were dated on days when he'd told me he was working late or traveling for business. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I should just ignore it and move on. But I couldn't. Every time I looked at the receipts, I could feel my stomach twisting tighter. There was a pit in my chest that wouldn't go away. I began to replay the past few weeks in my head, searching for anything that might explain it. There were the late nights, the odd phone calls, the way he seemed distracted when we were together. But even when I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, I couldn't ignore the way I felt when I looked at those receipts. It was like a dark cloud hanging over everything I had thought I knew. I became obsessed with the details. The dates, the locations, the names on the receipts. I wanted to know everything, to figure out what he was hiding from me. I even started Googling some of the restaurants, trying to imagine him sitting there with someone else, sharing a bottle of wine, laughing, enjoying a meal I should have been a part of. The thought of him touching someone else, looking at her the way he used to look at me, made my chest ache. I didn't know who she was, but it didn't matter. I was consumed by the idea that I wasn't enough for him anymore, that whatever bond we'd shared had already been broken. I started noticing more things that didn't add up. Small changes in his behavior. He'd become more secretive about his phone, keeping it face down whenever it was near him. He'd flinch when I walked into the room while he was texting, quickly putting his phone away, like I didn't have the right to see who he was talking to. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the more I observed, the more it felt like I was being shut out. I realized I wasn't the first person he thought about anymore. I wasn't the one he turned to when he needed someone to talk to. The worst part was how easy it was for him to keep this secret from me. It wasn't like I didn't trust him, or at least I hadn't thought I had any reason to. But the realization that Mason could lie to me so effortlessly, that he could have this whole other life without me knowing about it, broke something inside of me. I had always thought we were honest with each other, that we had an unspoken understanding that we would be there for one another no matter what, but now it felt like I didn't know him at all. I tried to focus on other things to distract myself, but nothing helped. The receipts were always there, lingering in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Every time I looked at him, all I could think about was the woman he'd been seeing, the one who had taken my place in his life. I didn't know what she looked like or who she was, but I imagined her constantly, her laughter, her touch, the way he must have looked at her when they were together. It felt like I was being slowly suffocated by these thoughts, unable to escape the truth that was becoming clearer and clearer. There were moments when I tried to push everything aside, to tell myself I was being dramatic, that maybe it was just a misunderstanding, but every time I did, the doubt crept back in, stronger than before. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The receipts were proof, plain and simple. They were the evidence I couldn't deny. I had trusted him, and now, that trust was shattered, leaving me standing there in the wreckage of our relationship, unsure of what to do next. The hardest part wasn't even confronting him, it was the way he'd made me question everything we had. Every memory, every moment we'd shared, now felt tainted. I kept thinking about the intimacy we had, how real it had felt. How could it have been real if he could so easily lie to me, betray me? The more I tried to make sense of it, the more I realized there was no sense to be made. I wasn't part of his world anymore. I was an afterthought, and whatever connection we once had had already faded, replaced by something else. Something he wasn't even bothering to hide anymore. The day I decided to confront Mason was one of the hardest days of my life. I had spent so many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to handle what I had discovered. I thought about just letting it go, pretending I never found the receipts, trying to go back to the life we had. But deep down, I knew that would never be possible. The truth was already out, and it was suffocating me. The doubt had taken root, and there was no way to push it aside anymore. I needed answers, even if they shattered everything I thought I knew about Mason and our relationship. I waited for the right moment. I didn't want to bring it up during one of his busy nights or when he was stressed from work. I needed him to be fully present when I confronted him. The day he came home later than usual, I knew it was time. My heart was pounding in my chest as I heard the front door creak open. I had the receipts in my hand, my fingers white from gripping them so tightly. They felt like the heaviest thing in the world, but they also felt like the only thing standing between me and the truth. I had to face him, even though I wasn't sure I could handle what was coming. When Mason walked in, he gave me a tired smile, his eyes flicking to the couch where I was sitting. I could tell something was off. I hadn't said anything yet, but he could feel the tension in the air. He'd probably sensed it for days, maybe even longer. The unease that had been growing between us must have been evident in the way I was looking at him. There was no pretending, no brushing it under the rug anymore. I was done with the silence. "Hey," he said softly, dropping his bag by the door, but I couldn't bring myself to answer him right away. I just looked at him, holding the receipts between my hands. He saw them, and for a brief moment his face tightened. I could tell he was calculating how to react, whether to lie, deny, or confront me, and for the first time in our relationship, I didn't know how he was going to respond. "Mason," I began, my voice shaky, "what's this? What are these receipts for?" I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to create a scene, but my heart was racing, and the words came out more quietly than I'd intended. He took a step forward, his eyes flickering between the receipts and my face, but there was no panic, no shock. There was just a sort of resignation, like he had already been preparing for this moment in his own way. "Are you going to tell me the truth?" I asked, my voice trembling. I couldn't hide the hurt anymore. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine. I had trusted him with my heart, with my life, and this betrayal was eating away at me. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sighed and sat down beside me, his body language tired and closed off. His hands rested on his knees as if he was bracing himself for something. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could feel my stomach churning, the anticipation thick in the air. I didn't know if I was ready for the answer, but I couldn't go on pretending like I was blind to the truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost distant. "It's not what you think," he said, but the words didn't hold the conviction I expected. There was no fire, no fight in him. He wasn't pleading with me, wasn't trying to explain himself. There was just an empty honesty in his voice, as if he had already accepted whatever was about to happen between us. He wasn't the man I had once known. "What is it?" Then I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mason, these are hotel receipts, fancy dinners at places we've never been. Who are you lying to?" I felt the tears start to well up, but I held them back, refusing to let them fall. The anger and betrayal were choking me, and I needed to hear him say it. I needed him to say it out loud, so I could understand what had happened to the man I thought I knew. He met my gaze, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once held. "I've been seeing someone else," he finally admitted, his voice almost monotone. It was like he had been waiting for me to ask, like he had already made peace with the words. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep lying to you anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't process them right away. I just sat there, staring at him, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The betrayal, the shock, it was all so much to take in. I had trusted him with everything, and now he was sitting there, admitting to an affair without any real emotion, without any apology. There was no guilt in his eyes, no regret in his voice. It was like he had already moved on. "I never meant to hurt you," he continued, his tone softer now, but it was too late. His words didn't make it any better. "But I've been unhappy for a while. I don't know how it happened, but it did. And I didn't know how to fix it." I could hardly breathe as I processed what he was saying. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted, had already checked out. He was explaining his actions like they were just a series of mistakes, like I was supposed to understand. But I couldn't understand. I didn't want to. This wasn't something that could be explained away. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was betrayal, pure and simple. The truth had shattered everything, and now I was left with the pieces, unsure of how to move forward, or if I even wanted to anymore. The silence between us felt suffocating. I sat there trying to make sense of his words, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I kept telling myself that I must have misheard him, that maybe I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. I had heard it loud and clear. Mason had been seeing someone else, and it had been going on for longer than I could have ever imagined. The man who had promised me forever, who had made me feel like I was the only one, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And there he was, sitting beside me, as if this was just another conversation. I couldn't look at him. Not anymore. Every time I tried, my mind flashed to the image of him with someone else, sharing the things that were supposed to be ours: his laughter, his touch, the way he used to look at me. I had trusted him with my heart, with everything I had, and now it felt like that trust had been destroyed beyond repair. His admission still lingered in the air, hanging like a storm cloud. There was no denying it. No pretending that things were okay. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't just pretend this wasn't happening. "So, who is she?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt bitter on my tongue, like they were cutting into my throat. I didn't want to know the answer, but I needed to. I needed to know who had taken the place that used to be mine in his life. The thought of her made my stomach turn, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to hear it from him. Mason shifted uncomfortably beside me, his hands rubbing the back of his neck like he was suddenly unsure of himself. But it was too late for him to pretend that this was just a mistake. There were no excuses left. The truth was right in front of us, and we couldn't avoid it any longer. He sighed before speaking again, his voice softer this time, but still devoid of emotion. "Her name's Katie," he said, his words slow, as though he was carefully choosing them. "We met a while ago. It wasn't planned. We started talking and things just happened." His voice trailed off, as if he was trying to find the right way to explain the unexplainable. But I didn't need an explanation. I needed honesty, even if it hurt. "Katie," I repeated, tasting the name on my lips like it was some kind of foreign word. I didn't know her, didn't even know what she looked like, but I hated her already. I hated everything about her. I hated that she had gotten a version of him that I would never get back. The thought of him holding her, kissing her, laughing with her, it made my chest tighten with jealousy and rage. I had been so sure of us, so confident in what we had. And now here I was, sitting next to the man who had betrayed me, hearing the name of the woman who had taken that all away. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He had been hiding this from me, lying to my face while I trusted him. The thought of all the moments we'd shared, his half-truths, his excuses, made me sick. I had believed in him, believed that we were building something real, something unbreakable. But it had all been a lie. He didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting away from mine. There was no emotion in his eyes, no regret, no remorse. I had expected some kind of apology, some sign that he realized the gravity of what he had done. But there was nothing, just empty words that couldn't erase the hurt. "I didn't know how to stop," he said quietly, almost like he was speaking to himself. It wasn't that simple." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my entire world, was telling me it wasn't that simple. As if there was any excuse for what he had done. As if the years we had spent together meant nothing. I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand how much pain he had caused me. But the words wouldn't come. "Don't," I said, cutting him off. I couldn't listen to any more of his explanations. It was too late for that. The damage had already been done. "Don't try to make this sound like something it's not. You cheated on me, Mason. You lied to me. And I can't keep doing this." He looked at me, his face strained, but still there was no real emotion behind his eyes. He looked tired, almost defeated, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for him. I was done. There was nothing he could say to fix this. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't undo what's already happened." The finality in his voice hit me like a slap. It was like he had already moved on, already accepted that what we had was over. And I realized in that moment that I had to move on too. I had to stop holding on to the person I thought he was, the man who had promised me so many things, because that person no longer existed. I stood up, the anger and sadness mixing inside me, pushing me to walk away before I completely lost myself. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't listen to his excuses or his apologies. I was done. The person I had once loved was gone, and all I had left was the memory of the betrayal that had ripped us apart. I don't think I truly understood the weight of what had happened until after Mason left. It was like everything I had once known about love, about trust, had been flipped upside down. The moments we had shared, the memories we had built, suddenly felt like nothing more than illusions. I had spent days, weeks, months trying to piece together what had gone wrong, trying to find an explanation that made sense. But the truth was there, clear and undeniable, and no amount of rationalizing would change it. I had been betrayed, and I wasn't sure how to move on from that. After Mason left, everything felt strange. The house felt empty, like a shell of what it once was. It was quieter than usual, and the silence seemed to echo through the rooms. I kept expecting him to walk through the door, to call out my name like he always had, but he didn't. He was gone, and I was left to navigate a life that had been broken apart by lies. It was surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. I kept waiting for the pain to subside, for the anger to fade, but it didn't. It was as if every corner of my existence had been contaminated by his betrayal. I spent the first few days in a haze, not really knowing what to do with myself. I kept thinking about the past, replaying every moment, every conversation, trying to see where I had missed the signs. There were so many little things I had overlooked, so many moments where I should have trusted my gut. But I had loved him, and love made me blind to the things I didn't want to see. The lies, the secrets, the manipulation, none of it had mattered because I had believed in him, in us. And now that belief felt foolish. I threw out all the things that reminded me of him, the gifts, the mementos, even the pictures. It felt like a small act of reclaiming control, of forcing myself to let go of the past. But it didn't make the hurt go away. Every time I looked at an empty space on the wall or felt the silence in the house, it was like another piece of me was being chipped away. I wanted to move on, to forget what had happened, but it was hard when it felt like the betrayal was still lingering, still tainting every part of my life. I spent a lot of time questioning myself, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. I blamed myself for not seeing the signs earlier, for not confronting him sooner. Maybe if I had been more attentive, if I had asked the right questions, things would have turned out differently. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The truth was, Mason had chosen this. He had chosen to lie, to cheat, to betray the trust that we had built. And no matter what I did, no matter how many ways I tried to rewrite the story, that fact would never change. As time passed, I started to slowly rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was taking 2 steps forward and 5 steps back, but I was determined not to let him have control over my happiness anymore. I started spending more time with friends, with people who cared about me. They listened when I needed to talk, and they gave me the space to grieve. I leaned on them when the weight of the betrayal felt too heavy to carry alone. Slowly, I began to remember who I was before Mason, before the lies, before the hurt. It wasn't easy, but I was learning to find my way again. The hardest part was learning to trust myself again. I had let my intuition slip away, had allowed myself to ignore the red flags because I didn't want to believe the worst. I had trusted Mason with everything, and he had shattered that trust in ways I never thought possible. It felt like a betrayal of myself, and that was the part one struggled with the most. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let someone I loved hurt me like this? But little by little, I started to forgive myself. I realized that I wasn't to blame for what Mason did. His actions were his own. I had loved him with everything I had, and I had been a good partner. The betrayal wasn't about me failing or being unworthy, it was about him making a choice to lie, to betray the love we had shared, and that was something I couldn't control. I began to find peace in letting go of the anger, in accepting that I couldn't change what had happened. It was a process, and it wasn't always easy, but I was learning that my happiness didn't depend on someone else. I could stand on my own, find my own strength, and rebuild my life. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be days when the pain would feel fresh, but I knew that I was capable of moving forward. And so I did. Slowly but surely, I began to reclaim the parts of me that had been lost in the wake of his betrayal. I learned to trust again, not just others, but myself. I learned that I deserved more than the lies and deceit I had lived with for so long. I was stronger than I had ever realized, and I was finally starting to believe that I could have a future beyond the pain, beyond the heartbreak. Mason was gone, and with him, a chapter of my life had ended. But I was just beginning to write the next one, and this time it would be mine, no one else's.